All right. Hello, and what is up, everyone? Today we're going to be talking about the West. So, the time period, the several decades after the Civil War, this is the period when America is completing its manifest destiny. And really, the West is always expanding. Since the time period when Europeans first arrived, began colonizing on the East Coast, like the 13 original colonies, the western frontier for like the British colonists at that point was like the Appalachia region. And then, of course, after the French and Indian War and then American Revolution times, we were getting just into the West being like the states of Ohio. And by the Civil War, Lincoln's home state of Illinois was kind of the western boundary. Texas was just being settled, and joining the country in 1845, but there weren't that many people there. And California became a state in 1850 with that compromise, but again, not that many people out west. So the West, during this time period after the Civil War, during the Gilded Age that we're talking about, is the area west of the Mississippi River, and it's finally being colonized for realsies. There are many farmers, miners, immigrants who are going to find economic opportunity out west. There is a lot of minerals. We talked about before what made this time period so prosperous for our country was our immense resources, our natural resources, gold, silver, copper, you name it. So mining companies are going to be doing very well for themselves out west. And with mining companies, you also have a lot of need for cheap labor, which is going to bring out a lot of immigrants. You're going to have a lot of Chinese immigrants in the West Coast in California. You're going to have a lot of Mexican immigrants coming and working for the mining companies across the West as well. Other areas and ventures for Western activity, you're going to have the cattle boom, which we'll talk about with Texas mainly, and the Great Plains and Kansas, which is going to be the era of the cowboy, and that's 1870s, 1880s. You're also going to have, of course, hundreds of thousands, and by the end of the century, millions of homesteaders, these poor farmers coming out into the Great Plains, mainly thanks to the Homestead Act. But keep in mind through all of this that there is this romanticism about the West as this place in America's psyche that is always free, always undefinable, always the place of opportunity. The old saying, "Go west, young man." You need to find yourself. You need to learn how to be a man. You need to be independent. This idea of the rugged individual, which we'll talk so much about, like in the 1920s and stuff, was always the West. Go west, young man. That's where opportunity lies. But the thing is, that myth, that romanticism, is very different from the reality of the West. Living out in the West was hard. And this difficult lifestyle, while there were opportunities, they were hard pressed and hard won opportunities. And mostly they're going to be opportunities for big businesses and corporations, not really for individuals. And The other thing that a lot of people don't understand is that none of this Western expansion, this manifest destiny, this American spirit of individuality out in the West would have been possible were it not for the efforts of the federal governments pushing for this westward expansion and settlements. For instance, in 1862, in the middle of the Civil War, it was Lincoln's administration that passed the Homestead Act and the Morrill Land Grant Act, and the Railroad Pacific Act. These things are going to, with the Homestead Act, allow millions of mostly poor immigrant families to settle out in the Great Plains, to get a tract of land, 160 acres for themselves. The Morrill Land Grant Act is going to be instituting colleges and universities out west. And the Railroad Act is going to, of course, pave the way for the Transcontinental Railroad. The Union Pacific and the Central Pacific lines meeting in 1869, completing the first railroad that spanned east to west across the entire country. None of these things would have been possible without the federal government spending money, and then also, taking the U.S. cavalry, our military, and going out west to clear this land of Native Americans, because there were over 250,000 Plains tribes, Native Americans, not just Plains, but Western tribes that were living out there that are not going to be pleased with all of these white European homesteaders invading their lands, taking over their resources, and the trains, crisscrossing their native lands and infringing on their buffalo. I'm looking at that picture right there. That will be a big part of the Indian Wars during this time period. As the U.S. government waged war against the Indian, they waged war against his food source, the buffalo, almost causing the American buffalo to go extinct. There's a picture of some of the Chinese immigrants. There's a prospector panning for gold. There's, of course, some Plains Indian tribe. The Apache, the Comanche, the Sioux, the Lakota, all of these tribes we're going to be exploring, as well as the Nez Perce. Can't forget about the Nez Perce. And when we talk about the West, what do we mean? Well, again, in this time period, in the late 1800s, it's everywhere west of the Mississippi River. So that's a pretty darn big chunk of land. You got the Grand Canyon there in Arizona. You have the Great Plains across the Dakotas, Kansas, Nebraska, all the way down to Texas. You have the Pacific coastline and the Sierra Nevada mountains in California. The West is a very varied place. You have all of these different landscapes, geographies, biomes. They all make up the American West. So again, it's not really a specific one thing. It's all of this. But it was this untapped land and possibilities that America is going to be exploring during this time period. A lot of the promotional materials for the Homestead Act were meant to encourage settlement as fast as possible to help the railroads get people and companies out there so that we could start making some money off of those resources, mostly gold and silver. And so a lot of the promotional advertisements for the Homestead Act were highly propagandized, and they would even show like giant fruits and vegetables and show like, oh, it's so easy. I wish I had a picture of it. It's so easy to grow things out west. All you have to do is literally drop a seed and it just springs to life. Now, the reality, again, was very different. The reality is going to be that life on a homestead was very hard, especially for frontier women. One woman described her daily morning ritual as like basically, let me read it. I had to wake up at 4 a.m. All right, here we go. This was in Arizona. I had to get up 4 a.m., turn out my chickens, draw a pail of water, make a fire, put potatoes to cook, brush and sweep half an inch of dust off the floor, feed 3 litters of chickens, then mix biscuits, get breakfast, milk, besides work in the house, and this morning had to go half a mile chasing after them calves. That's just the morning, before the sun's even almost hardly up. Yeah, so a lot of these homestead families, these are the families that would purchase the 160-acre tracts from the Homestead Act. All they have to do to keep that land is show improvements within 5 years, which meant building a homestead house, which, there you go, made out of thatch, like straw, mud, clay, whatever's available. And the other thing they have to do within 5 years was to farm the land. And if they cultivated, if they showed those 2 areas of improvement within 5 years, they got to keep the 160 acres virtually for free, or $1.25 an acre. It was very, very cheap land. And there will be hundreds of thousands of families that will take advantage of this. Millions of people will settle the West because of the Homestead Act that originated in 1862, a Republican measure. Remember, the Republican Party came from like the Free Soilers, who wanted this sort of thing for individual white American families. But life was hard. The soil that you're dealing with in the Great Plains is like our soil here in Texas, very difficult. It is rough, it is hard, it's rocky. It is not the loamy, rich soil that you're going to have like in many areas, like on the East Coast or in the Southeast. So that does make it more difficult to plow your fields. And again, the invention of the steel plow by John Deere is going to be extremely important for farming this really tough soil of the Great Plains. In addition, a lot of these families, they are very poor. Some of them were Easterners looking to have a land of their own, but many of them were immigrant families traveling over from Europe. German families, Italian families, you name it. They're a very eclectic group, but they didn't have much money. When they came over from Europe, many of these immigrants had nothing but literally the shirts on their backs. So they get a homestead, and many of them will have to go heavily into debt, not only to pay the meager fee for acquiring the land, but also to, more importantly, like as far as like what they gotta spend their money on, buying the horse or the plow, the plow, the ox, whatever they're going to use to pull it, buying the other farm implements and tools. All of that took a lot of money, meaning that a lot of these farmers are going into debt. Um, it does create a very multicultural West. In addition to a lot of these immigrants settling with the homesteads, you also have a lot of African Americans who were eager to leave the racist Jim Crow South that was emerging after Reconstruction had ended. Many of these African Americans, even as soon as the Civil War was over and they had attained their freedom with the 13th Amendment, many will be leaving the South. We'll talk about the Great Migration, which is where many will be going up in the 20th century up to northern cities. But during this time period in the Gilded Age, there were thousands of African Americans that went west, like the Exodusters, who famously settled in Kansas. And many African Americans will end up on Western frontiers in various Western occupations. Famously, many ended up as cowboys in Texas. So this is kind of some of the life on the West. And don't forget, you also have Asian immigrants, so adding to the diversity of the West out in California, especially many Chinese who will be working on the railroads. A bonanza farm was like a large Western commercial farm versus like the homestead family farms. But all of these farms are very quickly going to be specializing. And by that, I mean like developing a cash crop. We talked a lot about this in the antebellum era with like the cash crop of the South being, you named it, I'm sure you did, or at least in your head you did, cotton, right? Um, Western crops would vary on what they would see as the biggest cash gain, but all of them will pretty much be developing a cash crop instead of just farming for their sustenance, because they're living on a more like an increasingly globalized market, where goods that were made in the American heartland or the American plains on these homesteads would be sold to an international market far off in Asia or in Europe on steamboats and whatnot. Remember, they can be shipped very quickly using the train. And so these even small scale farmers, they find themselves extremely susceptible to market changes in the world. For instance, if there was a drought in Argentina, that would affect your crops here in Nebraska. If there was oversupply going on in the world commodity of wool, I don't know, there you go, wool, then you'd find your prices in Illinois dropping. Okay, and so we are increasingly in a global marketplace, even by the time period after the Civil War. Speaking of a global marketplace, let's talk about beef. I got some beef to talk about. Texas is famous for the cattle industry. Texas, just on its own, not the United States, but the state of Texas is one of the world's biggest beef producers. I think only behind like Argentina and maybe one other place. So yeah, we got a lot of beef here. It's kind of what we're famous for. And it's why Texas is known as like the cowboy kingdom, or they also have called it cattle kingdom. Now, Texas and its history with the Longhorn. The Longhorn is probably the most famous breed of Texas cattle. Goes back to the era of Spanish colonization. The Longhorn was a domesticated Spanish breed that had been brought over and developed wild in the grasslands of South Texas over many decades. And it's extremely hardy. It means that this animal, the longhorn, the Texas longhorn, can survive off of less grass and other you know food than the normal cows can. It's kind of like you have horses, right? Different breeds of horses. Take a Mustang, for instance, also from Spanish stock. Mustangs can survive off of just a little bit of grass each day versus like a big honking, beautiful fast thoroughbred horse. It needs like 2 buckets morning and noon and night just to not die. Those are not hardy horses. And so, yeah, longhorns, they don't need a lot, very, very fuel efficient, and they make a lot of beef. So they have that great big, corn set. UT, right? That's why our biggest university, in fact, the University of Texas, is their mascot is the Longhorn, because it's such a big part of Texas history. But anyway, the original people that learned to work with the Longhorn were the people that brought them over, these Spanish cowboys, and eventually that became the Mexican cowboys, or the vaqueros. And so vaqueros actually taught the American cowboy everything that he's going to learn, all the tricks of his trade, how to rope, how to lasso, what kind of stirrups to use to guard your feet when you are roping, what kind of saddles to use. Keep in mind, like, English saddles don't have the horn. The horn is meant for roping, tying off your cow. And so all of these are learned from the vaqueros. And the history of the cattle boom and cattle kingdom after the Civil War goes back to the war itself, when Texas was producing most of the beef for the Confederacy. Remember, after the Battle of Vicksburg, when General Grant and Sherman of the Union Army are able to cut off the Confederacy at the Mississippi River, Texas was cut off. And so those cattle that had previously been, constantly shipping out to provide beef for the Confederate States are just now sitting there with no market to be sold to. And they do what animals do best when they're left to their own devices. They think of like rabbits. I know y'all have seen, some of you have probably seen Zootopia. Like when Judy is leaving on the train and it has the little sign and it shows like the population of Bunnyboro just keeps going up and up and up. They multiply, right? That's what animals do when they're left to their own devices. And so Texas Longhorn population just kind of multiplies. I'm exaggerating, but there are a lot of cows just kind of sitting there at the end of the Civil War. And some very smart entrepreneurs think, a lot of people out east really want some beef, but they have none. Here in Texas, we got all these extra cattle just sitting around. If only there was a way to move all these cattle over to those people in the east, we can make a whole bunch of money. And that's how the cowboy was born. And there's some very famous trails that are going to be used to drive these vast herds, sometimes 1,000 head at a time, up from South Texas, in the area you can see in dark red, all the way up through Waco. And they had to pass through Waco. You can see our city almost becomes like a bottleneck. And that is because we are along this very long river in Texas, the arm of Texas called the Brazos, right? And in the 1870s, 1880s, during the era of the cowboy, this is when there is a very famous bridge for the first time, really sturdy, big, beautiful bridge put across the Brazos River. And of course, that is the Suspension Bridge here in Waco, Texas. And the Suspension Bridge for our city is I'm not going to say world famous, but it was built around the same time period as the very famous, much larger Brooklyn Bridge. It was one of the first suspension type bridges in the world. And the Waco Suspension Bridge is what put our city on the map, so that by the end of the 1800s, Waco, Texas, right here, was actually the second biggest city in the entire state. behind only the city of San Antonio. So we were in 1900, Waco was bigger than Dallas, Houston, El Paso, Fort Worth, Austin, all of them. Because we were one of the major thoroughfares of this trail for bringing these longhorn cattle up to their final destination points. The final destination being up in Kansas at first, because let's see if you guys can figure this out. What would be in Kansas that could then take these cattle all the way to the east, like in Illinois, where they could be slaughtered and then turned into juicy hamburgers? The trains, the railroads. Remember Transcontinental Railroad? Remember all these railroads being built by Vanderbilt and everything else? The railroad was up in Kansas. That's the way to get them to the stockyards and the meatpacking plants in Chicago. And so that is the destination for all these longhorns. Sorry, cows. I really love cows. They're really sweet. They have those big, pretty eyes. Y'all ever, okay, sorry, brief tangent. Y'all ever see like those trailers, the stock trailers when you're driving along, maybe with your parents, or I don't know, some of you might have driving licenses by now. Scary thought. But like when you're driving along and you see the stock trailer and then you see the cow and you know it's destined to go to like the slaughterhouse and you know that's where it's on its way. And then like it's just staring at you at a red light, the back of its trailer while you're sitting in your car and you're just like, I wish I could save you, cow. Like I've literally broken down in tears because they have such pretty big soft doe eyes. Like it almost hurts my soul to think about that right now. But I haven't turned into a vegetarian, so clearly it hasn't hurt that much. But anyway, this trail that's going to take the Longhorn from South Texas all the way up to the train railroad heads up in Kansas at Dodge City and Abilene is called the Chisholm Trail. And if you go to our Waco Suspension Bridge on the MLK side of the bridge, that's the East Waco side, there's actually a big tombstone trail marker that identifies it as part of the famous Chisholm Trail. And then, of course, on the west bank of the Brazos River, next to the suspension bridge, you can see all of those gorgeous Remington-style statues of cowboys, their horses, and the famous Longhorn cattle. And that is, again, because of the Chisholm Trail. Waco was built up as a stopping point for all these cowboys as they would have to pay to bring their cattle across the bridge, and then they would stop and resupply and, rest and get fresh horses or whatever they needed to do. And that was at Waco. They also had a stopping point very famously at Fort Worth. Fort Worth Stockyards is the reason that Fort Worth became known as Cowtown. And then, like I said, they'd have to go up through Indian country, which was what Oklahoma was known as. Remember from the Trail of Tears, that was the destination for all those 5 civilized tribes. And then up to Kansas. And the nice thing about this is that for the wranglers, you don't need a lot of men to take a whole bunch of cattle up this long, long drive. You could have with like less than a dozen men, again, take like 1,000 head of cattle because the cattle mostly follow each other. They have herd instinct. That's where you also have to risk, worry about stampedes happening. If one cow starts running, the others are inclined to follow it. It's kind of like how horses are. They have that herd instinct. And as far as price went, for a $2 cow down in San Antonio, you could fetch $40 for that cow up in Kansas. And this is in late 1800s money. You're talking major, major money when you bring up a huge herd with every cow being worth that much. And additionally, the overhead as you're traveling is very low because the cattle can graze as you travel along. You don't have to be constantly buying, hay or grain for it. So those are all reasons why the cowboy became very famous and very prosperous and rich for this short time following the Civil War. This is the era of the cattle boom. But when we talk about, economic terms like booms, you also have to consider the bust, which is when, something goes down in price and you lose your money. And so why does the era of the cowboy end? Because, most Texans today, we're not cowboys. In fact, most Texans probably never even touched a cow. Most Texans today live in cities. which I find kind of funny. Have y'all ever traveled somewhere, or you met up with family that's from somewhere not in Texas, and they're like, or some tourists that you meet from somewhere, they find out you're from Texas, and they're like, "Oh, you're from Texas? Do you say y'all?" Or do they ask like, "Do you ride a horse?" Or "Are you a cowboy?" That's the stereotypical image of what a Texan is today. But that's not who we are. And so, yeah, there is a boom and bust cycle when it comes to the era of this cattle kingdom, and it comes to an end. It doesn't last for very long by the 1880s, 1890s, because a series of droughts, no grass, no cows, and also a lot of farmers and like goat ranchers and others were very frustrated at these cattlemen, these cowboys, for constantly taking their herds across their lands. When you have 1,000 cattle, each one with 4 feet, so 4,000 feet stomping around. These are huge animals, by the way. A single longhorn. I'm not like, I know horses, typical average horse weighs about 1,000 pounds. My big girl, she's 17 hands. She weighs about 1,300 pounds. Cattle are much stockier. I want to say they weigh closer to a ton or even more, maybe like 25 to 3,000 pounds. It depends on the size. But each one of those, 1 ton, 2,000 pound animals crushing around on this ground. And imagine you just had a rain or something, that ground is going to have nothing growing. It's going to be destroyed, trampled, stampeded, stomped on, dead. And so farmers were very frustrated at these cowboys and at their herds. And so to keep them off of their land, farmers are going to fence off their acreages. This is a lot of land we're talking about that needs to be fenced off if farmers want to actually protect it from these huge herds of cattle. And they also need something that's pretty strong over, hundreds, if not thousands of miles of land. But that would require a lot of money. And this is where the invention of barbed wire is going to occur. And barbed wire was really instrumental in the end of the era of the cowboy, because you can't take your herds through barbed wire fencing. I mean, I guess you could get some, barbed wire cutters and do that, but yeah, barbed wire is exceptionally strong and durable, and it's got those little barbs on it, so the animal's not going to want to go through it. And if they try, they're probably going to get cut up real bad. We had a little horse who, his first time being away from his mama when he was being weaned, he was 6 months old. There was, of course, a storm, and of course, we were stupid, and we put this little baby horse in with another horse friend in a pasture away from his mom that had barbed wire. And there was a storm that night, and the little baby got spooked, and he ran right into the barbed wire fence and cut his neck to the jugular. Like, you could see the jugular throbbing, like that much meat just chunked away, because horses' necks are pretty thick. Don't worry though, I would not mention this if it was a terrible ending. He survived, and I think he's still doing well. We sold him a long time ago. This is like 15 years ago. But barbed wire can do some nasty damage to animals, and so that is another reason why the era of the cowboy ends. That and drought. All right. And as far as gold rushes go, there was a gold rush in the Dakotas. Remember, there's North and South Dakota. In 1876, this is going to push a lot of Native Americans, particularly the Sioux tribe, further west. And it was actually in 1876 when you have the height of the Indian Wars, which we'll talk about next time. There was also, of course, gold discovered in 1848 at Sutter's Mill in California, which triggers the California Gold Rush, the 1849 Gold Rush, and eventually California became a state so quickly. And then there was also gold discovered in Alaska in 1896 in the Klondike region, which is actually right on the border with the Yukon Territory of Canada. Now, as far as Alaska goes, America had purchased Alaska from Russia in 1867. Remember that President Andrew Johnson, the guy who succeeded Abraham Lincoln, he had kept on, not really by his own inclinations, but he'd been forced to keep on many of Lincoln's cabinet secretaries, including his Secretary of State. William Seward. And William Seward was actually part of the assassination conspiracy plots. Not like part of it, but he was one of the victims of it. Sorry, I should have said that. He was one of the victims of it. They were planning to kill Seward, kill Lincoln, kill Grant, and kill Andrew Johnson, the vice president. And they ended up only killing Lincoln, but they did severely wound Seward, who had just suffered a nasty fall. And he'd had actually one of those stabilizing things around his neck, and was in bedridden. And his son stopped the assailant and was stabbed. And Seward tussled with the man before guards could come in and save him, and was actually stabbed himself. And the only thing that prevented him from being stabbed in the neck by the guy was this device that he had around him. Poor Seward. But anyway, that same William Seward, Secretary of State, is going to purchase Alaska from Russia in 1867. And a lot of people, we spent, I think, $1 million, $2 million, whatever it was a pittance. It was super, super cheap how much we purchased Alaska for. But most people were saying, why did you spend any money on it at all? Like, what are we going to do with this frozen ice box up there? And that's what they called it. They call it Seward's ice box, Seward's folly, like his mistake. Like, Seward, what you doing, man? This was dumb. This is a waste of money. There's nothing up there. It's just frozen wasteland. Of course, everybody was left being wrong when gold was discovered in 1896. And then, of course, something even more valuable is very plentiful in Alaska, and that is black gold, otherwise known as oil. So Alaska has been a very good investment for the United States, not just for its mineral natural resources, but also because of its geographic location. We have a lot of military bases and tourism and other things in Alaska today. So that is Alaska. As far as the Klondike Gold Rush goes, it will bring a lot of people, not just to Alaska, because Alaska's population, let's be honest, it's not going to grow too much. Alaska is one of the least populated states in the United States, even if it is our largest in size, because half the year it's freezing cold there. Literally right now in December, it's that dark all day long. They have, I think, 1 or 2 hours of daylight right around the equinox. It's pretty bad. And mosquitoes in the summertime are huge in Alaska. It's a very harsh environment. And for the prospectors that went to Alaska in the Klondike Gold Rush, they are going to, many of them, either be forced to turn around or die in their struggle to find gold. You can see some of the pictures here, the harrowing, snowy cliff hike. You could see, I think this might be Skagway or Ketchikan. And you could see the sled dogs and stuff, like Balto and Nome, Alaska. There's some great stories with it. Yeah, for the Klondike Gold Rush, you had 100,000 prospectors set out. Less than a third of them actually make it to their destination. Like I said, many turn back. For those that stuck it out that didn't make it, they either died from exposure, which is from the extreme cold. They didn't come properly supplied. They ran out of food. And then many were even killed by the wildlife of Alaska itself. And if you want to know what the most dangerous animal is in all of Alaska, you might be surprised. Take a guess. It is not the polar bear. It is not the wild seals. It is not the penguins. Whoever guessed that, no. It's actually the moose, because they're huge and extremely territorial. Don't come between a mama moose and her babies. Very dangerous. Okay, and the last thing I want to talk about with you guys before we close up this lecture is some of the trails and the birth of Utah. Nevada is going to become a state pretty quickly because of mineral rights and mining companies. Utah is going to become a state in 1896, mostly because of the Mormons. Remember that the Church of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormons, they are coming about as a religious sect from the Second Great Awakening in the 1840s. And by this time, in around the time of the Civil War, they were led by a man named Brigham Young. And one of the most famous practices of the Mormons that had caused them to have to flee west and escape because they were being so heavily persecuted was their practice of polygamy. polygamy is where you, as usually the husband, take on multiple wives. And this was a very common Mormon practice. And Brigham Young actually personified this. He, as the leader of the Mormon people, had taken on 55 wives throughout his lifetime, mostly at the same time. So again, that's polygamy. Now, many people were uncomfortable with this practice and uncomfortable with also the close association Mormons have between church and state and a lot of other Mormon practices. And so they are heavily persecuted. They go out to Salt Lake City in Utah, and they're going to encounter a lot of violence. There's the Mountain Meadows massacre, was where there was a traveling caravan of wagons that was headed, I think, up to Oregon. There's also the Oregon Trail, of course, during this time in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. But this group, they were actually stopped as they passed through the Mormon territory and set upon, and 100 of these settlers were killed by the Mormons when they were traveling through Utah. So the federal government was not very pleased with the Mormon activity, and it won't be until the 1890s when Utah finally gets to become a state. They had to drop officially the practice of polygamy. They had to also get rid of the close association with church and state, but that is why Utah will finally get to become a state by 1896. Last thing I'm going to leave you with, remember these trails out west, remember the railroads, the Transcontinental Railroad. All of these are going to be bringing lots and lots of white American and European settlers out into Indian country. And it's going to be causing enormous friction and tension with Native Americans that we'll see basically lead to the Indian Wars. All right. Thank you guys so much. And I will talk to y'all later. Maybe. If this thing will stop. We'll see.